Few places on earth have witnessed the rise and fall of so many empires, so many gods, so many kings, and yet remained standing. Most nations are born in a single century. Egypt was born before Rome existed, before Greece had philosophers, before the rest of the world had learned to write. This is not just a country, this is a civilization. And civilizations do not die easily. In the next 30 minutes, we will compress 5,000 years of one of the most extraordinary stories in human history. Pyramids that still stand without explanation. Empires that swallowed continents whole. Conquests by Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, and Europeans. And yet, beneath every foreign flag, beneath every new religion and every new language, something ancient survived. Something Egyptian. This is the story of how one civilization, battered, invaded, occupied, and humiliated, refused to disappear. This is Egypt. Before we begin the journey, understand the single thread that runs through every chapter of this story: survival. Not just the physical survival of a people, but the survival of an identity, an Egyptianness that proved impossible to fully erase, no matter who came to conquer. Every great civilization has a heartbeat. For China, the mandate of heaven. For Rome, glory. For Egypt, it has always been the Nile. That single river cutting through thousands of miles of desert is the reason Egypt exists. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, named for the dark, fertile soil the Nile left behind each flood season. Every dynasty, every religion, every empire grew from those banks. Keep that in mind as we travel through time. Because no matter who ruled Egypt, the Nile kept flowing, and wherever the Nile flowed, Egypt endured. The story begins not in drama, but in mud. Around 10,000 BCE, the Sahara was not the desert you know today. It was green. Hunter-gatherer communities roamed across a landscape filled with rivers and wildlife. But around 5000 BCE, the climate shifted dramatically. The rains disappeared, the grasslands dried up, and the people were pushed, as if by the hand of fate, toward the only water source left, the Nile. What happened next was one of the most important accidents in human history. These displaced communities, crowded along a single river valley, were forced to cooperate or die. They learned to manage the annual Nile floods. They developed irrigation. They grew surplus grain. And with surplus came something new: civilization, class, governance, writing. By around 3100 BCE, the scattered communities of the Nile had coalesced into two distinct kingdoms, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Then came the moment that Egyptians would celebrate for 3,000 years to come. A king named Narmer, or Menes, depending on which historian you ask, unified the two kingdoms under a single crown. The world's first nation-state was born. What followed was extraordinary. Within just a few centuries, the ancient Egyptians had developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems the world had ever seen: hieroglyphics. They had organized a centralized bureaucracy capable of managing millions of workers. They had developed a religion of breathtaking complexity, with dozens of gods governing every aspect of life, death, and the afterlife. And they had begun to build in stone, on a scale no civilization before them had ever attempted. The Old Kingdom, spanning roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, is when the pyramids were built. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed under Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, stood for nearly 4,000 years as the tallest man-made structure on Earth. Think about that. The same building that archaeologists are still trying to fully understand was old when Julius Caesar walked its shadow. It was ancient when Muhammad was born, and it still stands today. But no civilization rises forever. Around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed, brought down not by invasion, but by internal fractures. Regional governors, called nomarchs, had grown powerful enough to challenge the pharaoh. A prolonged drought caused agricultural failures. The central state fragmented into competing warlords. Egypt's first golden age ended not with a bang, but with a slow unraveling. But this was not the end. It was never the end. After a period of fragmentation known as the First Intermediate Period, Egypt reunified under a new line of kings from Thebes. This Middle Kingdom, roughly 2055 to 1650 BCE, saw a cultural and literary renaissance. Egyptian art reached new heights of sophistication. Trade expanded south into Nubia and east into the Levant. It was a second flowering, quiet and deep. And then came the strangers from the east. The Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant, had been slowly migrating into the Nile Delta for generations. They were not raiders, they were settlers. But by around 1650 BCE, they had grown powerful enough to seize control of Lower Egypt, establishing their capital at Avaris. For the first time in its history, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. The Egyptians were horrified. Their entire worldview rested on the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, divine harmony, and foreign rulers violated that order at the deepest level. But the Hyksos also brought something valuable: new military technology, the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, bronze weapons superior to anything Egypt had produced. And Egypt, humiliated but never stupid, learned every lesson. Around 1550 BCE, a Theban prince named Ahmose III did what seemed impossible. He launched a war of liberation against the Hyksos, drove them from Egyptian soil, and reunified the two lands under Egyptian rule once more. Egypt did not just survive the occupation. It emerged from it transformed, angrier, stronger, and with a new strategic ambition. Never again. What followed was the New Kingdom, and it was Egypt at its most spectacular. Determined to create buffer zones against future invasions, pharaoh after pharaoh pushed Egypt's borders outward, south into Nubia, east into the Levant and Syria. At its height, the Egyptian empire stretched from the Euphrates River in modern Iraq to the fourth cataract of the Nile in modern Sudan. Egypt had become a superpower. The New Kingdom produced history's most iconic figures. Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh for over 20 years, building monuments her successors tried but failed to erase. Thutmose III, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, won 17 consecutive military campaigns. Akhenaten abolished the entire Egyptian pantheon and replaced it with a single solar deity in history's first recorded monotheism, only to have his revolution undone after his death. And then there was Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, who ruled for 66 years. He built more monuments than any other pharaoh and negotiated the world's first known peace treaty with the Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh. He outlived 13 of his own sons. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, was issued a passport by the Egyptian government in 1974, with king listed as his occupation. The New Kingdom was not just military conquest, it was cultural explosion. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs were buried in hidden tombs packed with treasure, the Book of the Dead, a manual for navigating the afterlife. Egyptian religion had become one of the most elaborate theological systems in human history. But around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Not just to Egypt, but to the entire Mediterranean world. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. Within decades, the Hittites vanished, Mycenaean Greece fell, and the great city of Ugarit was burned and never rebuilt. The cause is still debated: drought, earthquakes, the mysterious sea peoples, or some catastrophic combination. But the result was undeniable. Egypt survived, but barely, and in greatly diminished form. The New Kingdom staggered through the invasions of the sea peoples, beating them back at great cost. But the empire was gone. The treasury was empty. The priests of Amun at Thebes had grown so powerful that they effectively ruled Upper Egypt, independently of the pharaoh. What followed was the Third Intermediate Period, a long, fragmented age of competing dynasties, Libyan warlords, and Nubian pharaohs. Egypt had become a prize to be won, rather than a force to be feared. But this was not the end. Egypt had survived before. It would survive again. In 525 BCE, Egypt fell to Persia. Cambyses II marched his armies into the Nile Valley and ended the last native pharaonic dynasty. For the next 2 centuries, Egypt was a province of the Persian Empire, though a restless one, constantly revolting, never fully subdued. Egyptian identity proved remarkably resilient even under Persian boots. Then came Alexander. In 332 BCE, he swept through the Persian Empire, and Egypt, which had no love for its Persian rulers, greeted him as a liberator. He visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where priests declared him the son of the god, and founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast. The city became the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the greatest library in history. After Alexander's death, Egypt passed to his general Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled for nearly 3 centuries, cleverly adopting Egyptian customs, worshipping Egyptian gods, and appearing on temple walls in pharaonic style, even while Greek remained the administrative language. 2 civilizations lived side by side, quietly reshaping each other. The last of the Ptolemies was also the most famous. Cleopatra VII was the only member of her dynasty who actually learned the Egyptian language. She allied with Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony in a bid to preserve Egyptian independence. When they were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and took their own lives, Egypt became a Roman province. The pharaonic age was over, or so it seemed. Under Roman rule, Egypt became the breadbasket of the empire. The Nile's grain fed Rome. Alexandria remained a great city. Christianity took root early and deeply in Egypt. The Coptic Christian tradition traces its origins to the Apostle Mark himself. Even under Roman rule, the Egyptian people maintained their language, their faith, and their sense of who they were. By the 7th century CE, Egypt had been part of the Byzantine Empire, the Christian successor to Rome, for centuries. But in 639 CE, everything changed again. Arab armies under the general Amr ibn al-As swept out of the Arabian Peninsula, riding the extraordinary momentum of the new Islamic faith. Within just a few years, they had conquered Egypt almost completely. This was not merely a political conquest. It was a civilizational transformation, the most thorough Egypt had ever experienced. Over the following centuries, Arabic replaced Coptic as the everyday language of most Egyptians. Islam replaced Christianity as the dominant religion. A new city, Fustat, eventually growing into Cairo, became the center of power, replacing Alexandria. Egypt was remade. And yet, and this is the key, something Egyptians survived even this transformation. The Coptic Christians never disappeared. The attachment to the Nile, to the land, to a deep sense of being a special people with an ancient destiny, persisted beneath the new Islamic identity. Egypt absorbed the Arab conquest just as it had absorbed every conquest before it, not by resisting it, but by making it Egyptian. Under the Fatimid Caliphate in the 10th and 11th centuries, Cairo became one of the great cities of the Islamic world. Al-Azhar University, founded in 970 CE and still operating today, making it one of the oldest continuously functioning universities on earth, became the foremost center of Islamic scholarship in the world. Egypt was not just a Muslim country, it was a Muslim intellectual capital. The medieval period brought terrifying forces. The Crusaders threatened Egypt itself. Then came the Mongols, the most devastating military force the medieval world had seen. By 1258, they had annihilated Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate in a catastrophe that left the Islamic world in shock. Who could stop the Mongols? The answer was Egypt, specifically the Mamluks. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, originally bought as children from Turkic and Circassian peoples, trained from birth as elite warriors, and converted to Islam. They had gradually seized power in Egypt, and in 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, they did what no army had managed to do before. They defeated the Mongols in open battle. The Mongol advance into Africa and the Mediterranean world was stopped. The Mamluk Sultanate ruled Egypt for over 2.5 centuries, from 1250 to 1517. They were brutal, factional, and frequently assassinated each other in palace intrigues, but they were also tremendous builders and patrons of art and architecture. The grand mosques and madrasas of medieval Cairo largely date to the Mamluk period, and they kept Egypt free from Mongol destruction that had devastated so much of the Islamic world. Egypt had survived the most destructive force of the medieval age, but a new empire was rising in the north. In 1517, the Ottoman Sultan Selim III invaded Egypt, defeated the Mamluk forces, and incorporated Egypt into the vast Ottoman Empire. For the next 3 centuries, Egypt was a province, important for its grain and its strategic position, but no longer a center of power. The great days of Egyptian political independence seemed distant memory. The Ottomans allowed the Mamluks to continue as local administrators under Ottoman governors, creating a strange hybrid system that satisfied nobody well. Egypt stagnated. The Ottoman Empire itself was slowly declining, falling behind the rapidly industrializing powers of Western Europe. By the late 18th century, Egypt was a backwater, wealthy in agricultural potential, but politically and militarily weak. Then, in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte sailed from France with 38,000 soldiers and landed in Egypt. He also brought 167 scholars tasked with documenting every aspect of Egyptian civilization. The result was the Description de l'Egypte, a monumental work that introduced Egypt's ancient wonders to a European audience and launched the modern field of Egyptology. Napoleon was forced out by the British and Ottomans, but his expedition permanently altered Egypt's relationship with the modern world. Out of the chaos that followed Napoleon's departure rose one of the most consequential figures in Egypt's modern history, Muhammad Ali Pasha. An Albanian-born Ottoman commander, he maneuvered brilliantly through the post-Napoleonic power vacuum, eliminated his rivals in a spectacular massacre of the Mamluk leadership in 1811, and established himself as the de facto ruler of Egypt. The Ottomans technically remained his nominal overlords, but Muhammad Ali had other plans. Built schools, hospitals, and a modern bureaucracy. His armies conquered Sudan and challenged the Ottoman Empire itself, at one point marching as far as Anatolia before European powers intervened to stop him. He is considered the father of modern Egypt, and his descendants ruled the country until 1952. But modernization brought vulnerability. The construction of the Suez Canal, opened in 1869 under his grandson Khedive Ismail, was a monumental engineering achievement, cutting the sea route between Europe and Asia by thousands of miles. But it also buried Egypt in debt and made it irresistible to European imperial ambition. In 1882, Britain invaded and occupied Egypt, beginning a 70-year period of British domination that Egyptians would never fully forgive or forget. Under British occupation, Egypt nominally remained under its own rulers, the Khedives and later the kings, but real power rested with the British consul general. Egyptian cotton enriched British textile mills, The Suez Canal served British imperial interests. Egyptian nationalists agitated, were jailed, and agitated again. The humiliation was deep and structural. On July 23, 1952, a group of military officers known as the Free Officers Movement launched a coup against King Farouk, a monarch widely seen as corrupt, ineffective, and too close to foreign interests. Farouk was sent into exile on his yacht, and for the first time since the Pharaohs, Egypt was ruled by Egyptians. The dominant figure of the revolution was Gamal Abdel Nasser, charismatic, fiercely intelligent, and driven by a vision of pan-Arab unity free of Western domination. His nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 triggered a global crisis. Britain, France, and Israel launched a military invasion and were forced to withdraw under US and Soviet pressure. Nasser had stood up to 3 foreign powers and won. His popularity across the Arab world was incandescent. Egypt and Syria briefly merged into the United Arab Republic, a dream of Arab unity that lasted only 3 years before Syria seceded. Nasser nationalized industries, built the Aswan High Dam, a monumental infrastructure project that controlled the Nile's floods and generated enormous electricity, but also drowned ancient Nubian homelands beneath its reservoir. He positioned Egypt as the leader of the non-aligned movement, navigating the Cold War between the US and Soviet blocs with skill. And then came the catastrophe of 1967. Israel's preemptive strike destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in hours. Within 6 days, Israel had captured the Sinai, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, the most humiliating military defeat in modern Arab history. Nasser offered to resign. Millions took to the streets begging him to stay. He died in 1970, the Sinai still occupied. Millions mourned him as a father. Nasser was succeeded by Anwar Sadat, a quieter figure but no less consequential. In October 1973, Sadat launched the Yom Kippur War, crossing the Suez Canal and pushing Israeli forces back in a surprise attack. That partially restored Egyptian military honor. Though the war ended inconclusively, Sadat had achieved his real goal, demonstrating Egyptian strength and opening the door to diplomacy. In 1979, Sadat did the unthinkable. He signed a peace treaty with Israel, the first Arab country to do so. The Camp David Accords, brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, returned the Sinai to Egypt and earned Sadat the Nobel Peace Prize. But they also made him a pariah in the Arab world and ultimately cost him his life. In 1981, he was assassinated by Islamic extremists within his own military during a parade in Cairo. Egypt entered a long, exhausting period under Hosni Mubarak, who ruled for 30 years through a combination of patronage, repression, and managed stability. Egypt was at peace, but stagnating. Corruption was endemic. Unemployment among the young was crushing. The security services were everywhere, and beneath the surface, something was building. On January 25, 2011, it erupted. Egyptian protesters flooded Tahrir Square in numbers no one anticipated. For 18 days, in the face of tear gas and live ammunition, they held the square. On February 11, 2011, Hosni Mubarak resigned. The world watched in astonishment as a regime that had seemed immovable simply crumbled before the cameras. The revolution did not bring democracy. Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood won Egypt's first free election in 2012, but his year in power was turbulent. In July 2013, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi launched a coup, removing Morsi and initiating a brutal crackdown. Hundreds were killed, thousands imprisoned. The Arab Spring had ended in counter-revolution. Sisi was elected president in 2014 and has ruled Egypt since, winning re-election in contests that critics describe as neither free nor fair. His government has imprisoned journalists, activists, and opposition figures at rates that exceed even the Mubarak era. The emergency law, suspended briefly after 2011, returned. Surveillance is pervasive. And yet Egypt faces genuine challenges not reducible to authoritarianism. A population exceeding 100 million depends on a river under threat. Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile threatens Egypt's water security in ways Egyptian leaders describe as existential. Negotiations between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan have repeatedly collapsed. For a civilization synonymous with the Nile, the prospect of losing that water is almost incomprehensible. Sisi has launched massive infrastructure projects. A new capital city rising from the desert east of Cairo, an expanded Suez Canal, ambitious housing programs. Egypt has also positioned itself as a regional diplomatic power, mediating between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, maintaining its relationship with both the United States and Gulf Arab monarchies. On the global stage, Egypt remains one of the Arab world's most consequential states. Too large, too central, and too historically weighted to be ignored. We began with a simple idea, that Egypt is not merely a country, it is a civilization. And civilizations, as Egypt has demonstrated more convincingly than almost any other, do not die easily. Think of what Egypt has survived. The collapse of the Bronze Age, which destroyed nearly every other civilization of its time. Persian conquest, Greek conquest, Roman annexation, Arab invasion, Crusader attacks, Mongol advance, stopped thanks to Egyptian and Mamluk courage at the last possible moment. Ottoman absorption, British colonialism, military dictatorship, and revolution. Through every upheaval, something persisted. The Coptic Christians still pray using a liturgical language descended directly from ancient Egyptian. The farmers of the Nile Delta still harvest in rhythms their ancestors established 7,000 years ago. When an Egyptian says their civilization is the mother of the world, al-Dunya, they speak from a depth of historical experience that few peoples on earth can match. The pyramids still stand. The Nile still flows. Cairo, now home to over 20 million people, still hums with the chaotic, exhausting, magnificent energy of a civilization that refuses to be finished. The questions that Egyptians face today, about democracy, about water, about economic development, about identity and religion, and the place of an ancient civilization in a modern world, are new versions of questions that Egyptians have been wrestling with for 5,000 years. Who are we? What do we owe to our past? What do we dare to dream for our future? From Narmer to Nasser, from the first pyramid to Tahrir Square, from the Nile's first floods to the modern dam wars threatening its flow, 5,000 years of survival, of reinvention, of an identity that bends but does not break. This is Egypt, the oldest civilization still standing. The story, as always, is not over.